Forget the Hollywood version where everyone is either a celibate knight or a frolicking peasant. The truth, as it so often is far more complex and much more human. The Church's stance on sex was a beautiful, chaotic tangle of theology, pragmatism, and pure, unadulterated fear. On the one hand, you have the grand sweeping statements that declared sex, even within marriage, as a necessary evil, something to be endured for the sake of procreation, a grim reminder of humanity's fallen state. This wasn't some fringe idea, it was a mainstream historical fact, the dominant theological line of thinking. The most pious of couples were encouraged to sleep in separate beds and only come together for the express purpose of making a baby. The act itself was seen as a regrettable concession to our earthly desires, a primal force that had to be contained and controlled at all costs. You were essentially supposed to put on your most somber face, grit your teeth, and get it over with, all in the name of God and air production. But here's where it gets interesting and frankly a little confusing. The Church, for all its grand pronouncements, was also a deeply practical institution. It recognized that people being people were going to have sex anyway, so it had to create a framework, a set of rules to manage the inevitable. Think of it less as a moral high ground and more as a spiritual traffic cop trying to keep the accidents to a minimum. It established the sacrament of marriage, which for all its restrictions was also a license for sexual activity. You see, marriage was the only legitimate container for sex. Outside of it, you were straying into the dangerous territory of fornication, adultery, and a whole host of other sins that could land you in serious spiritual hot water. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky or fringe tidbit. While sex for pleasure was generally frowned upon, the Church did acknowledge that it was a natural byproduct of the marital act. They didn't exactly celebrate it, but they weren't entirely blind to it either. Some confessional manuals, those guides for priests to interrogate their parishioners, would list different positions and acts, not necessarily to condemn them all, but to sort of categorize their level of sinfulness. It was a bizarre, almost bureaucratic approach to human intimacy. They were trying to build a tax code for pleasure, and you can almost feel the priests sighing in frustration over the nuances. For instance, the missionary position was the standard, correct way, as it was seen as the most procreative and least pleasure-focused. Anything else, and you were treading on thin ice, maybe getting a few Hail Marys for your trouble, depending on your confessor's mood and how much he'd had to drink that morning. This brings up a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these rules were truly meant to be followed to the letter, or if they were more of an aspirational ideal, a sort of do as I say, not as I do situation. Were most people actually having sex only for procreation, or did they simply perform their penance and get on with their lives? It's tough to say. We have the manuals, the theological treatises, and the sermons, but we don't have the diaries of the average peasant couple from the 14th century. We can only infer from the constant repetition of the rules that people were in fact breaking them quite a lot. You don't build a massive set of no-fun signs unless people are having a lot of fun. The Church's anxiety over sex wasn't just about sin. It was also about order. Sex was a powerful, chaotic force that, if left unchecked, could upend the social hierarchy. It could lead to illegitimate children, which complicated inheritance and land ownership. It could lead to jealous rages, feuds, and violence. So by channeling it into the regulated institution of marriage, the Church was also acting as a social and political stabilizer. This is why marriage became a sacrament, a holy contract that was nearly impossible to break. It wasn't just about love. It was about property power and population control. The love part was, well, a nice bonus if you happened to get lucky. It's like buying a new car. The manual tells you how to drive it perfectly, but you know you're going to speed a little on the highway, and the manufacturer knows it too. They just have to give you the rules anyway. And in the medieval world, the church was both the manufacturer and the traffic cop. They told you what was safe, what was sinful, and what you could get away with, all with a straight face and a stern, knowing look. This dual nature, this blend of lofty moralism and grounded practicality, is the key to understanding everything that follows. It's the foundation of a world that was far more tangled and far more human than you might think. As you settle deeper into the soft blankets of the past, let's move from the grand pronouncements of the church to the quiet, dusty pages of medieval marriage manuals. You might imagine these were all romance and whispered sweet nothings, but you'd be surprised. These weren't the steamy paperbacks of our time. No, these were legal, social, and spiritual contracts outlining the very specific obligations you and your spouse were expected to fulfill right down to the bedroom. The most important of these was the concept of the conjugal debt, and it was a real binding obligation. This is a crucial mainstream historical fact. Both spouses were legally and morally required to provide sexual satisfaction to the other upon request. Yes, you heard that right. If your spouse came to you and you were feeling, shall we say, indisposed, you couldn't just say no, not without a very good reason anyway. This was a profoundly practical and surprisingly egalitarian rule for its time. It wasn't just about the husband's right to an heir. It was about mutual obligation. The woman had the right to ask for sex as well, and her husband was expected to provide it. The logic here was twofold. First, it was a way to prevent adultery. By ensuring that both partners' needs were met within the confines of marriage, the church hoped to reduce the temptation to stray. It was a classic give a little to get a lot situation where the little was grudgingly permitted intimacy and the lot was social order and spiritual purity. Second, it was seen as a way to maintain peace within the household. A denied spouse, a frustrated heart. These were seen as potential sources of discord and bitterness. By making it a duty, the church was essentially trying to legislate marital harmony. Imagine having a chore chart for your intimate life. Wednesday, do the dishes. Saturday, pay the conjugal debt. It wasn't exactly romantic, was it? Now for a wonderfully quirky tidbit. The rules of the conjugal debt were not without their loopholes and exceptions. A spouse could in fact refuse, but only for certain holy or spiritual reasons. For example, during times of fasting on holy days or when a couple had mutually agreed to a period of chastity for spiritual devotion. A wife could also refuse if she was ill, pregnant, or nursing. But here's the interesting part. The reasons had to be in theory legitimate and not simply a matter of whim. You couldn't just say, I'm not in the mood. You had to be able to point to a valid, church-approved reason for your refusal. Some theologians even debated whether a woman's conjugal debt could be temporarily suspended if her husband was, shall we say, a bit too demanding or if he was unfaithful. They were essentially creating a whole legal framework around who gets to say no and why, which is a surprisingly modern-sounding debate for the 13th century. This brings us to a point where historians still argue whether these duties were truly a two-way street in practice. While the manuals state the obligation was mutual, there's no doubt that the social and power dynamics of the time would have heavily favored the husband. A man's request was likely taken much more seriously than a woman's, and the social repercussions for a woman who refused were probably much harsher. The sources we have written, mostly by men, theologians, lawyers, and priests, present a kind of idealistic framework that may not have reflected the daily reality for a peasant wife who had little power to enforce her own rights. Were these rules truly a liberation for women, or were they just another way to institutionalize their subordination, albeit with a thin veneer of mutuality? It's a debate with no easy answer, lost to the silent histories of countless medieval marriages. The details in these manuals were often astonishingly specific. They detailed things like the proper frequency of intercourse, what to do on certain feast days, which was nothing, by the way, and even what to avoid. For instance, sex was forbidden on Sundays, feast days, and during Lent. It was also forbidden on the days a woman was menstruating, which was seen as a period of ritual impurity. It was an incredibly prescriptive, rule-bound approach to intimacy. The Church saw itself as the ultimate arbiter of every aspect of human life, and the bedroom was no exception. It's like having a very nosy neighbor who is also your boss, your lawyer, and your spiritual advisor, and who has a strong opinion on everything from your dinner to your, well, nightcap. These marriage manuals weren't just about sex, though. They were about the entire fabric of married life, from managing a household to raising children. They saw the conjugal act as a fundamental, albeit spiritually perilous, part of that fabric. It was the glue that held the family, and by extension, society together. The Church's pragmatic decision to institutionalize sex through marriage and to provide a detailed, if sometimes comically strict, rulebook for it tells you a lot about their priorities. They were less concerned with passion and pleasure, and far more focused on order, stability, and the production of new souls for the kingdom of God. So the next time you think of medieval romance, remember that it often came with a hefty dose of legal obligations and a strict schedule, all approved by a priest. Let's shift our gaze now from the legalities of the conjugal debt to the fascinating and often bizarre world of medieval medicine and its understanding of the female body. As you sink deeper into this story, imagine yourself not in a cold stone church, but in the cluttered workshop of a physician, the air thick with the smell of herbs and burning charcoal. Here the female body wasn't just a vessel for procreation. It was a mysterious and powerful landscape, full of secrets that even the most learned men struggled to understand. This is a mainstream historical fact. The prevailing medical theory, rooted in the teachings of the ancient Greek physician Galen, believed that both men and women produced sperm to create life. The man's was hot and active, while the woman's was a colder, more passive fluid. But here's the key difference: for a woman to release her fluid and become fertile, she had to experience pleasure. This wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was a medically necessary component of conception. The woman's seed, as they called it, was thought to be released at the moment of orgasm, and without it, a pregnancy was unlikely to occur. You can almost hear the sigh of relief from medieval couples when you realize this. It meant that sex for the purpose of making a baby couldn't be a completely joyless affair. It had to be a collaborative effort where the husband had a medical duty to ensure his wife's pleasure, not just his own. This single belief, so different from the Church's condemnation of pleasure, created a strange and wonderful tension in the medieval mind. On one hand, you have the theologians telling you to grit your teeth and think of God, and on the other, you have the doctors telling you that if you don't make sure your wife has a good time, there won't be any baby. It's like getting conflicting advice from your priest and your family doctor, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Now for a wonderfully quirky tidbit. The uterus was seen as a living, almost sentient organ with a mind of its own. It was believed to wander throughout the body if it became dry or hungry from a lack of sexual activity. This wandering uterus could then cause all sorts of maladies, from headaches to hysteria, a word, by the way, that comes from the Greek for uterus. This belief was so widespread that physicians would prescribe sexual intercourse or even a certain type of pelvic massage as a cure for a woman's various complaints. Imagine going to the doctor for a cough and him prescribing a little intimacy to keep your womb from getting lonely. It was a bizarre and, from our modern perspective, deeply unscientific way of looking at the body, but it also gave a certain agency and power to the female anatomy. It was something that had to be attended to, placated, and kept happy, or else it would cause chaos. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether this medical understanding of female pleasure was a liberating force or just another form of control. Did it genuinely empower women by giving them a recognized medical role in conception, or was it simply a different way of framing their purpose as purely reproductive? The belief that a woman's pleasure was necessary for procreation, while seemingly progressive, could also be seen as a form of pressure. A woman who struggled to conceive might be blamed for not experiencing enough pleasure, adding another layer of anxiety to an already difficult situation. It's a classic chicken and egg problem. Did the medical theories influence the social norms, or did the social norms simply find a convenient explanation in the medical theories of the day? We'll likely never know for sure, but the very existence of the debate tells us a lot about the complicated position of women in medieval society. The understanding of the female body was a mashup of ancient texts, folk wisdom, and a healthy dose of superstition. They believed, for example, that the right time for conception was after a woman had her period and on a night with a full moon. They also believed that a woman's seed was more powerful when she was in a state of high passion, which meant that a baby conceived in a moment of great pleasure was more likely to be strong and healthy. This created a peculiar incentive for couples to, well, have a good time. The physicians' manuals, in their own way, became a kind of secular sex manual, offering advice that directly contradicted the Church's austere pronouncements. So while the priests were telling you to be chaste and somber, the doctors were whispering that a little passion might be just what you need. And remember that crocodile dung sunscreen. It was all part of the same medical approach, a blend of the practical and the profoundly strange. Now that we've peeked into the strange medical world of the medieval bedroom, let's pull back the covers and explore the gnawing anxieties of desire itself. You're no longer a married partner fulfilling a duty, but a person grappling with the powerful, often condemned force of lust. For the unmarried, for the clergy, for anyone not bound by the holy sacrament of marriage, this was a constant and terrifying battle. The Church's message was clear and uncompromising. Sex was a sin outside of marriage, and even the thought of it could be a dangerous path to eternal damnation. The goal, therefore, was not to manage desire, but to extinguish it entirely. The moral dangers of lust were a mainstream historical fact, preached from every pulpit and written into every theological treatise. It wasn't just about the physical act. It was about the state of mind, the wandering thoughts, and the impure fantasies. Lust was seen as the first domino leading to a cascade of other sins, from gluttony to sloth. It was a spiritual cancer that could corrupt your very soul. The most common advice for dealing with these unruly urges was twofold mortification of the flesh and constant prayer. You were encouraged to fast, to wear rough fabrics against your skin, to take cold baths, and to engage in strenuous physical labor to exhaust the body and hopefully the mind. Monks would engage in self-flagellation, not just to atone for sins, but to literally beat the desire out of themselves. It was an incredibly harsh and relentless campaign, against a natural human impulse. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky or fringe tidbit. In the absence of modern psychology, medieval people and their spiritual guides used very creative methods to understand and manage these desires. One popular belief was that the devil, or his demonic minions, was responsible for planting lustful thoughts in your mind. This meant that the struggle wasn't just against yourself, but against a supernatural enemy. You weren't just a person with a crush. You were a soldier in a spiritual war, and every fleeting thought of an unclothed body was an enemy ambush. This belief, while perhaps frightening, also provided a certain comfort. It meant that your desires weren't necessarily yours. They were external attacks you could fight with holy water prayer and the sign of the cross. It was a kind of spiritual defense mechanism, turning a personal struggle into a cosmic battle. But this led to a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Church's intense focus on controlling desire was a genuine attempt to protect souls or a clever way to exert social control. By framing all non-procreative sexual expression as a mortal sin, the Church was able to dictate a huge portion of people's daily lives, from what they wore to whom they spoke. The fear of damnation was a powerful tool for social order. It meant that unmarried couples were less likely to run off together, that young men were less likely to challenge the authority of their elders, and that the clergy remained, at least in theory, a celibate class, set apart from the worldly concerns of family and lineage. It's tough to untangle the spiritual motive from the political one, but the two were almost certainly intertwined. Was it about saving your soul or about ensuring you stayed in your place? The advice given to the unmarried was often incredibly specific. Young men were told to avoid bad company, to keep their minds focused on their work, and to not look at women for too long, lest their eyes become the gateway to sin. Young women were advised to be modest in their dress and demeanor, lest they tempt men and become a source of sin themselves. The burden of control was placed on everyone creating a society where the mere hint of flirtation could be seen as a grave spiritual risk. It was a world of averted gazes and cautious conversations where the specter of lust was always lurking just beneath the surface. It was a difficult and often lonely existence for those who couldn't or wouldn't get married. And for those who had taken a vow of celibacy, like the priests and monks and nuns we'll discuss later, the struggle was even more intense. It was a constant war against themselves, a spiritual marathon that many were destined to lose. As the candlelight cast long shadows on the wall, let's step beyond the anxieties of the unmarried and peer into a world of forbidden pleasure. This isn't about the accepted, if begrudging, intimacy of marriage. It's about the wild, dangerous, and sometimes darkly humorous realm of sins the Church deemed unforgivable. You're now a parishioner, kneeling in a dark confessional about to reveal a secret you hope won't land you in eternal damnation. The list of forbidden acts was long detailed and utterly unforgiving. It was a world where a wrong move in the bedroom could have eternal consequences. A mainstream historical fact is that sodomy was considered the gravest of all sexual sins. But forget what you think you know about the term. In the medieval context, sodomy wasn't just a code word for homosexuality. It was a catch-all term for any non-procreative sexual act, any act that was considered against nature. This included oral sex, anal sex, bestiality, and even certain sexual positions other than the missionary position. The logic was simple, if harsh. The purpose of sex was procreation, and any act that deliberately circumvented that purpose was a direct rebellion against God's plan. The penalties for these sins were severe, not just in this life, but in the next. Confessors were taught to ask direct, sometimes shockingly graphic questions to root out these transgressions, and the penance could be brutal, including long periods of fasting prayer or even public humiliation. For a wonderfully quirky tidbit, the church also had very specific ideas about what was called luxuria, or lust. They created a kind of spiritual hierarchy of sins. Fornication, or sex between unmarried people, was a sin, but a lesser one. Adultery was more serious because it broke a sacred vow. But the most insidious form of lust was often considered to be simple masturbation, or as it was sometimes called, self-pollution. This was seen as a profound waste of the body's vital fluids and a self-indulgent act that served no purpose other than carnal pleasure. The penance for it was often quite severe, sometimes equivalent to that for fornication. The anxiety around this particular sin was pervasive, and it tells you a lot about the church's obsession with control and their fear of any form of pleasure that couldn't be regulated and contained. It's the ultimate example of a rule against something that is, for most people, an entirely private and personal act. It's like having the spiritual police watching your every private moment. This brings us to a point where historians still argue whether the church's focus on these sins was driven more by theological doctrine or by social control. The emphasis on unnatural acts served to reinforce the traditional family structure and the patriarchy that underpinned it. By condemning sodomy in its broadest sense, the church was able to dictate everything from family dynamics to inheritance. A man who engaged in sodomy, or whose wife did, was failing in his primary duty to produce legitimate heirs. A couple who used oral sex was not only sinning, but was also, in the church's view, subverting the very purpose of their union. It's difficult to separate the spiritual from the social, and historians debate whether the church was genuinely trying to save souls from these acts or simply trying to save society from what they perceived as a breakdown of order. The forbidden acts weren't just about sex, they were also about the subversion of the natural order. Bestiality, for example, was seen as a direct affront to God, blurring the lines between man and beast. Sexual encounters with demons or other supernatural beings, which we'll discuss later, were considered the ultimate act of spiritual treason. The church was trying to build a wall around human intimacy, defining what was holy and what was profane, what was natural, and what was an abomination. And the punishment for crossing that line was not just a few Hail Marys. Depending on the severity of the sin and the social status of the sinner, the penalties could range from severe penance to public excommunication, and in some cases even death. It was a world where a whispered secret could become a public shame, and where a private moment could have eternal consequences. The very phrase, "a world of forbidden pleasure," is almost a misnomer. For most, it was a world of terrifyingly forbidden risk. Now let's leave the cold stone walls of the European church and travel east across deserts and seas to the bustling, sun-drenched cities of the medieval Islamic world. You're no longer a European parishioner, but a scholar in a grand library, the air thick with the scent of papyrus and exotic spices. The books you're reading aren't about sin and damnation. They're about the art of love-making, the pleasures of the body, and the secrets of desire. Here, the perspective on intimacy was vastly different and in many ways far more celebratory and sophisticated than what we've been exploring. It's a mainstream historical fact that while the Christian church saw sex as a necessary evil, many Islamic scholars and physicians viewed it as a natural, healthy part of life, a gift from God to be enjoyed within the bonds of marriage. The goal wasn't to suppress desire, but to channel it to perfect it, and to use it to create a harmonious and joyful union. This led to a rich tradition of writing on the subject. Books like The Perfumed Garden, or the treatises of Avicenna and Altofashi, weren't just about making babies. They were manuals for pleasure, offering advice on everything from foreplay and positions to aphrodisiacs and techniques for prolonging arousal. The approach was clinical and practical, but also deeply sensual. It's like comparing a dry legal document to a beautifully written, poetic guidebook. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky tidbit. Many of these Arabic texts were astonishingly detailed and pragmatic. They would include entire sections on topics that would have been unimaginable in the European context. For example, they describe different types of orgasms, both male and female, and offer advice on how to achieve them. They even discussed how to deal with issues like impotence or a lack of desire, offering herbal remedies and psychological advice. They saw the body as an intricate machine, and they wanted to provide a full-service repair and maintenance manual. One text even listed dozens of types of female genitalia, describing the different characteristics and what might please a woman of each type. It was an anatomical and sexual catalog, and it shows a level of curiosity and a lack of moralistic shame that is breathtaking when you compare it to the medieval West. Historians still argue whether this rich tradition of sexual writing reflected the daily reality for the average person in the medieval Islamic world, or if it was more of an elite scholarly pursuit. Were the common people reading these books and following the advice, or was it the kind of thing only a wealthy courtier could afford to know? And did the existence of these texts truly translate to more sexual freedom and pleasure for women, or was it still a patriarchal system where men's desires were the primary focus? It's a complex debate, but the fact that these discussions were happening at all and in such an open and celebratory way is a testament to a different kind of cultural approach to intimacy. The Arabic manuals for lovemaking weren't just about the physical. They were also about emotional and spiritual harmony. They taught that a couple should strive for a shared joy in their intimate lives. They emphasized communication, mutual respect, and a kind of playful exploration of each other's bodies. The texts were often peppered with poetry, proverbs, and philosophical insights about the nature of love and desire. They saw the sexual act not just as a means to an end, but as a path to a deeper connection. This is a stark contrast to the European manuals we've seen, which were almost exclusively focused on procreation, sin, and the avoidance of temptation. Remember the Church's list of forbidden positions. These Arabic manuals would have seen that not as a list of sins, but as a list of possibilities. It's a reminder that history is not a single linear story, but a tapestry of different cultures and beliefs, each with its own unique approach to the most intimate parts of human life. Let's return to the medieval European mindset, not of sin and piety, but of biology and folklore, as we peer into the mysterious world of fertility and conception. You're no longer a scholar, but a peasant wife, desperate for a child, listening to the strange and sometimes comical advice of the local wise woman. This was a world where science and superstition were inextricably linked, and the creation of a new life was seen as a divine miracle, but one that could be influenced by a bizarre and contradictory set of rules. A mainstream historical fact is that the prevailing medical theory rooted in ancient Greek and Roman thought believed that conception required both male and female seeds to mix and combine. The man's seed was hot and active, while the woman's was cooler and more passive. The quality of these seeds and the timing of their release was thought to be paramount. This is why physicians and folk healers alike spent so much time trying to figure out the right time to have sex to make a baby. This wasn't just about the woman's cycle. It was also about the position of the planets, the phase of the moon, and even the direction of the wind. It was a holistic, if profoundly unscientific, approach to procreation, a kind of cosmic lottery, where you had to get all the right numbers to win a baby. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky tidbit. There were all sorts of bizarre beliefs about how to influence the gender of a child. It was commonly believed that a boy was conceived in the right testicle and a girl in the left. This led to some truly strange advice. To have a boy, a man might be told to tie off his left testicle during intercourse. Other, more practical-sounding advice included having sex on a cold night for a boy, or a warm night for a girl, or for the man to be on the right side of the bed for a boy and the left for a girl. There were also beliefs that a woman's more intense orgasm or a man's greater passion during the act could influence the gender. These theories, of course, had no basis in reality, but they provided people with a sense of control over a process that was, for the most part, entirely out of their hands. It was the medieval equivalent of trying to rub a lucky rabbit's foot before taking a big test. This leads us to a fascinating scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were born out of genuine scientific inquiry by the standards of the day, or were simply a way for a patriarchal society to place the blame for a lack of male heirs squarely on the shoulders of women. A woman who only produced daughters might be seen as having a cold or passive seed, a biological flaw that was her fault. The gender theories, while seemingly harmless, could also be a way to justify a man's disappointment and a woman's shame. Was it a genuine attempt to understand biology, or was it a convenient cultural narrative that reinforced the importance of sons and the dominance of men? We can't know for sure, but the fact that these beliefs were so widespread suggests they served a deep cultural purpose, whether it was scientific or social. The beliefs about fertility and conception weren't just about gender, though. They were also about the health and temperament of the child. It was thought that a baby's character was influenced by the circumstances of its conception. A child conceived in a moment of lust might be destined to be wild and passionate, while a child conceived in a moment of chaste, dutiful love might be calm and pious. This belief added a whole other layer of pressure to the act of procreation. You weren't just making a baby. You were, in a way, determining its destiny. It was a world where the quiet intimacy of the bedroom was believed to have cosmic consequences. And remember that wandering uterus. All of these beliefs, from the gender theories to the influence of the planets, were part of a unified, if deeply flawed, attempt to bring order and predictability to the chaotic and beautiful mystery of creating life. As we delve deeper into the medieval world of intimacy, let's leave the grand theories and wild superstitions behind for a moment and step into the apothecary's shop. You're now a person seeking not spiritual guidance, but practical help. The air is thick with the earthy smell of herbs, the sweet scent of honey, and the acrid tang of strange potions. This was the world of the medieval pharmacopoeia, where people sought to enhance pleasure, prevent conception, or even ward off sexual temptation with an astonishing array of concoctions. A mainstream historical fact is that people in the medieval period used a variety of herbs and natural substances as contraceptives and abortifacients. This wasn't a secret, shadowy practice. It was a widely accepted, if sometimes dangerous, part of folk medicine. Herbs like pennyroyal, savin, and rue were all commonly used to either prevent conception or terminate a pregnancy. The knowledge was often passed down through generations of women, from mother to daughter or from a wise woman to her apprentice. The Church, of course, condemned these practices as a form of murder and a rejection of God's will, but the reality was that people, especially women who didn't want more children, needed a way to control their own fertility. It was a classic clash between doctrine and necessity. The legal and social consequences could be dire, but the personal need was often more powerful than the fear of eternal damnation. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky tidbit. People also used a variety of strange and sometimes disgusting remedies to influence their sexual lives. For example, some people believed that wearing a piece of a weasel's testicle or a portion of a marten's urine in a pouch could prevent conception. Others believed that drinking a potion made of powdered elephant dung and wine could act as a potent aphrodisiac. And for men struggling with impotence, a common remedy was to eat a hearty meal of goat's testicles, which were believed to be full of masculine potency. These were not just old wives' tales. These were serious, albeit wildly misguided attempts to manipulate the body's natural functions. The idea was to absorb the vital essence of these powerful animals, and it shows a profound, if scientifically flawed, belief in sympathetic magic. It's a bit like trying to get a good night's sleep by wearing a pillow on your head. Historians still argue whether the use of these herbal remedies and potions was a form of proto-feminist resistance or simply a desperate attempt by people with limited options to control their own bodies. The use of contraceptives and abortifacients, while condemned by the Church, gave women a degree of autonomy over their reproductive lives. It was a way for them to say no to a system that saw them primarily as vessels for procreation. However, many of these remedies were incredibly dangerous and could be toxic, leading to illness or death. Was this a genuine act of empowerment, or was it a sign of desperation in a society with few other choices? The debate is a difficult one, as it forces us to confront the harsh realities of medieval life and the limited options available to people. The sexual apothecary wasn't just about prevention and enhancement. It was also about purity and sin. Some people used herbal remedies to reduce their own sexual desire to make themselves more chaste and pious. They might drink a concoction of water lilies and other calming herbs which were believed to cool the blood and quiet the passions. It's a strange mirror image of the aphrodisiac's one, to fire up the passions, the other to extinguish them. This shows a profound cultural anxiety around the idea of desire itself, and a desire to control it, not just through prayer and flagellation, but through chemical means. So while you may have been told to pray and fast to ward off temptation, you also had the option of drinking a nasty-tasting tea to help the process along. And remember that wandering uterus. You can bet there was a specific herbal concoction to keep it in its place too. It was a messy, contradictory, and deeply human way of trying to control the uncontrollable. As the night deepens, let's venture into the truly strange and terrifying corners of the medieval mind. We're leaving the realm of human intimacy for a moment and stepping into a world where the spiritual and the sexual collide in the most frightening way imaginable. You're no longer in the apothecary's shop, but lying in a bed, alone in a dark room, suddenly feeling a presence that is not of this world. This is the world of sex and the supernatural, a place where demons and incubus were not just folklore, but a very real and present danger. A mainstream historical fact is that the belief in sexual encounters with supernatural entities was widespread and deeply held. People truly believed that demons known as incubi for men who preyed on women and succubi for female demons who preyed on men would visit people in their sleep to have sex with them. The purpose of these encounters was not just for carnal pleasure, but for a darker, more sinister purpose to corrupt the human soul, to steal vital life force, and in some cases to even sire a demon child. The legend of Merlin, for instance, held that he was the son of an incubus and a human woman, a half-demon with immense power. These beliefs weren't just for peasants. They were written about by learned theologians and physicians who offered serious, detailed advice on how to ward off these demonic attacks. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky tidbit. There were detailed theological debates about the nature of these encounters. The great theologian Thomas Aquinas, for example, wrote about how an incubus might not be able to produce its own seed. The theory was that a succubus would first have sex with a man, steal his seed, and then transform into an incubus to have sex with a woman, thus using the stolen seed to create a demonic offspring. It's a kind of spiritual sperm bank with a very sinister purpose. This shows an astonishingly elaborate and speculative theological framework for something that was almost certainly the result of nighttime emissions, dreams, or sexual fantasies. They were trying to apply the logic of the church and medicine to a phenomenon they couldn't explain, and the result was a kind of spiritual horror story. Historians still argue whether the belief in incubi and succubi was a genuine spiritual fear or a kind of metaphorical way to talk about sexual urges that the church found unacceptable. For a woman, a nightmare about a sexual encounter could be explained away as an incubus, thus absolving her of the sin of having a lustful thought. For a man, a succubus could be a convenient scapegoat for a nocturnal emission, a biological process he couldn't control, but which the church had taught him was a form of self-pollution. Was this belief a way to rationalize and externalize sexual feelings that were deemed shameful and sinful? Or was it a reflection of a world where the line between the natural and the supernatural was much blurrier than it is today? The answer is probably a bit of both, but the debate is a great way to understand the complex psychology of a people living under a constant state of spiritual anxiety. The fear of sexual encounters with the supernatural was also a tool of social control. A woman who became pregnant out of wedlock, for instance, might claim that she was visited by an incubus to avoid public shame and the severe legal penalties of fornication. And for the church, it was a powerful way to reinforce the idea that sex outside of marriage was not just a sin, but an open invitation to demonic forces. It made the bedroom a battlefield, and every sexual thought a potential spiritual ambush. It's like being told that your most private personal moments are also the most dangerous, and that a demon could be lurking just outside the covers. It's a chilling thought, and it shows just how pervasive and all-consuming the fear of sin was in the medieval world. And you remember the anxiety over lust for the unmarried. This was the ultimate endgame of that anxiety. The horrifying possibility of a lustful thought turning into a living, breathing, and very demonic reality. Now that we've fled the spectral shadows of the incubus, let's turn our attention to a different kind of spiritual tool, one that was both a weapon and a guide in the war on sin. You're no longer the victim of a demon, but a parishioner on your knees in the small, dark box of the confessional, confessing your every transgression to a priest. This is the world of the Confessor's Handbook, a chillingly detailed guide that was used to root out every conceivable sexual sin. It was the church's way of creating a comprehensive spiritual tax code, and it left no stone unturned. It's a mainstream historical fact that these handbooks, like the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas or the manuals written by other theologians, provided confessors with a comprehensive list of sins and a series of questions to ask their parishioners. The goal was to ensure that every sin, no matter how minor or private, was confessed and atoned for. The sexual sins were given special attention. The handbooks would detail a vast array of forbidden acts from bestiality and sodomy to masturbation and even lustful thoughts. They provided a kind of checklist for the priest to go through asking questions that would have been shocking in any other context. The priest was, in effect, a spiritual detective, and the parishioner was a suspect in a crime against God. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky tidbit. The level of detail in these handbooks was often astonishing. They would classify sins not just by the act itself, but by the circumstances surrounding it. For example, the sin of fornication would be more or less severe depending on whether it was done for lust for money or under duress. They would even ask questions about the frequency of the sin, the duration, and the person's state of mind during the act. Some handbooks even went so far as to list different sexual positions and explain which ones were more sinful than others, with the missionary position being the least sinful, and anything else being a kind of spiritual sliding scale of damnation. It was a kind of spiritual bureaucracy, a detailed accounting of every possible transgression, and it shows a profound obsession with control. Historians still argue whether the existence of these handbooks made the confession process more about spiritual cleansing or more about social control. By forcing people to confess their most private thoughts and actions, the Church was able to maintain a huge amount of power over the lives of its parishioners. The threat of having to confess a certain sin and the shame and penance that came with it was a powerful deterrent. It's hard to say if the handbooks were a genuine attempt to guide people to a more virtuous life or a kind of a spiritual surveillance system. And what about the priests themselves? Did they enjoy this kind of interrogation, or did they find it as awkward and uncomfortable as their parishioners? The handbooks were a tool, but how they were used and the motivations behind their use is a fascinating and ongoing debate. The confessors' handbooks weren't just a list of sins, they were a roadmap to the medieval psyche. They show us what people were most afraid of, what they were most ashamed of, and what the Church was most concerned with. They reveal a world where the private life was in many ways a public concern, and where every thought and action was weighed and measured against an impossibly high moral standard. It was a world where a person could be judged not just for what they did, but for what they thought, and where a priest armed with his handbook had the power to peer into the darkest corners of your soul. Remember that debate about whether the conjugal debt was truly mutual. The handbooks in their own way reinforced that it was probably not by providing a detailed list of questions for the priest to ask about a couple's intimate life questions that would have been far more difficult for a woman to answer honestly, given the power imbalance of the time. The handbooks, in a way, were the ultimate manifestation of the Church's desire to regulate and control every aspect of human intimacy. Having escaped the priest's probing questions, let's turn our gaze to a different kind of window into the medieval soul, one filled with laughter, bawdy humor, and surprising frankness. You're no longer in the somber confessional, but in a tavern, a marketplace, or a private chamber, where the real unvarnished human spirit is on full display. This is the world of medieval pornography and bawdy humor, a side of life that the Church tried to suppress but could never fully extinguish. A mainstream historical fact is that while the Church was busy condemning all forms of non-procreative sex, a thriving culture of sexually explicit literature and art existed, often hidden in plain sight. This wasn't the glossy, mass-produced pornography of today. It was a more subtle, often satirical form of expression. There were bawdy folk songs, lewd poems, and illustrations in the margins of manuscripts that depicted sexual acts in a frankly humorous and uninhibited way. These weren't necessarily for a broad audience. They were often for the educated and wealthy who could afford such luxuries. But they show that the human desire for humor and sexual expression was far more resilient than the Church's attempts to control it. The famous and often hilarious marginalia of medieval manuscripts, where monks would draw cartoons of animals having sex or people with comically large genitalia, is a testament to this. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky tidbit. One of the most famous examples of this kind of bawdy humor is the collection of stories known as the Canterbury Tales. While the stories are often seen as a masterpiece of English literature, many of them are filled with crude jokes, sexual innuendos, and outright sexual encounters. The Miller's Tale, for instance, is a classic example of this. It's a story about a young student, a cuckolded husband, and a beautiful young wife, and it's filled with hilarious and graphic descriptions of sexual hijinks. This wasn't some underground illicit book. It was a work of art from a major poet, and it was widely read and enjoyed. It shows a side of the medieval mind that was far more worldly and far less puritanical than the church's handbooks would have you believe. It's like finding a dirty joke scribbled in the back of your spiritual textbook. Historians still argue whether this bawdy humor was a form of social resistance or simply a natural part of medieval life. Did people laugh at these jokes as a way of subtly pushing back against the church's strict moral code? Or was it just the way people talked? Was it a form of rebellion? Or was it just a normal, healthy part of human culture that existed alongside the piety and the fear of sin? The fact that it existed at all and in such a public and widely distributed way is a powerful argument against the idea that the medieval world was a grim, humorless place. It shows a kind of cognitive dissonance where people could be deeply pious on Sunday and then tell a dirty joke on Monday. This contrast is a key part of understanding the medieval psyche, and it's a reminder that human nature is messy and full of contradictions. The existence of medieval pornography and bawdy humor also sheds light on the class dynamics of the time. While the clergy and the educated elite might have been the primary audience for these works, it's safe to assume that a similar, if less refined, form of humor existed among the common people. Folk songs, tavern stories, and local legends were likely filled with the same kind of jokes and innuendos. It was a kind of shared sexual language, a way for people to talk about their desires, their frustrations, and their secrets without the fear of eternal damnation. And remember that fear of the incubus. The jokes about demons and sexual encounters were probably a way for people to deal with that fear, to turn something terrifying into something humorous. It's a classic human coping mechanism, and it's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of incredible pressure. The moral of this part of the story is that no matter how hard you try to suppress human nature, it will always find a way to express itself, and often with a wink and a dirty joke. Let's leave the tavern and the bawdy jokes behind and return to the more somber, but no less fascinating world of medieval medicine. This time we're not talking about fertility potions, but about the things that could go wrong. You're now a patient, and you've come to a physician with a problem that is both embarrassing and deeply feared, a sexual disorder. The remedies we're about to explore are a strange mixture of ancient wisdom, folk superstition, and sometimes a shocking lack of common sense. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval physicians had a surprisingly detailed, if often flawed, understanding of male impotence and female frigidity. They saw these issues not as a spiritual failing, but as a physical imbalance, often rooted in the theory of the four humors. An impotent man might be told that he had too much cold, phlegmatic humor, which was dampening his natural heat and vital energy. A frigid woman might be seen as having a similar imbalance, or as having a wandering uterus that was causing her distress. The treatments were often aimed at rebalancing these humors, and they could range from dietary changes to strange and sometimes dangerous medical procedures. The physician's goal was to bring the body back into a state of equilibrium, and in doing so, to restore the patient's sexual health. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky tidbit. The remedies for these disorders were often both bizarre and poetic. To treat impotence, a man might be advised to eat a special diet, rich in warming aphrodisiac foods like ginger cinnamon and garlic. He might also be told to wear a charm made of a cock's comb, or a certain kind of fish bone. But the most extreme treatments were truly wild. One text suggests that a man struggling with impotence should have his genitals rubbed with a paste made of powdered sparrow testicles and honey. The belief was that the sparrow, being a famously lusty bird, would transfer its vitality to the man. It was a kind of desperate, magical thinking, but it shows the profound fear and shame associated with these issues. The remedies for women were often no less strange, with some physicians prescribing herbal steam baths, special ointments, or, as we've discussed before, a certain kind of pelvic massage to get that wandering uterus to settle down. Historians still argue whether the medical understanding of sexual disorders was a genuine attempt to help patients or just another way to reinforce social norms. By blaming impotence on a physical imbalance, the physician was able to give the patient a sense of hope, but was also implicitly reinforcing the idea that a man's primary role was to be virile and a woman's to be fertile. The remedies, while often ineffective, provided a kind of psychological comfort, a sense that something was being done to fix the problem. Was this medicine a true science by the standards of the day, or was it a kind of a spiritual and social placebo meant to ease the patient's mind and keep the social order intact? It's a debate that forces us to look at the intersection of medicine, culture, and power. The treatment of sexual disorders wasn't just about the physical. It was also about the emotional and the spiritual. A physician might advise a patient to pray, to fast, or to engage in other spiritual practices to help them with their physical ailment. This was a world where the body and the soul were not separate, but deeply intertwined. A sexual problem was not just a medical issue. It was a sign that something was out of alignment in your entire life. This is why a treatment might include not just a strange herb or a magic charm, but a recommendation to spend more time in prayer or to mend a broken relationship. The medieval physician, in many ways, was both a doctor and a spiritual counselor. And remember that aphrodisiac made of elephant dung. While that was probably a fringe remedy, it shows the kind of desperate lengths people would go to in order to fix a problem that caused them so much shame and anxiety. It was a world of crude and sometimes dangerous medical advice, but it was also a world where a person's most private problems were seen as a reflection of their entire life. Now let's turn our attention from the messy realities of the body to the ethereal world of the heart and mind, a place where desire was sublimated into something altogether different. You're no longer a patient in a doctor's office, but a knight, a lady or a troubadour in a beautiful court, living in a world of high ideals and romantic poetry. This is the world of courtly love, a complex social code that contrasted starkly with the raw carnal desires we've been exploring. It was a world where passion wasn't just about the physical. It was about longing admiration and a kind of spiritual devotion. A mainstream historical fact is that courtly love was a highly ritualized and idealized form of romantic attraction, typically between a knight and a married noblewoman. It was a love that was unconsummated, a kind of spiritual and intellectual connection that was meant to be pure and chaste. The knight would serve his lady, performing great deeds in her honor, writing poetry to her and adoring her from afar. This love was not meant to lead to marriage or to sexual consummation. In fact, the very unreachability of the lady was a key part of the appeal. It was a love that was meant to be painful, to be filled with longing, and to be a source of spiritual and artistic inspiration. It was the complete opposite of the church's grim, procreative view of intimacy. It was a kind of romantic escapism, a way of finding beauty and meaning in a harsh and often brutal world. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky tidbit. While courtly love was meant to be chaste, it was also a game of subtle sexual tension and hidden messages. The poetry and the art of the time are filled with double entendre, clever metaphors, and veiled suggestions. The knight's service to his lady might be a metaphor for a deeper, more carnal desire, and the lady's acceptance of his devotion might be a sign of her own hidden passions. The very rules of courtly love, which demanded a constant state of longing and unfulfillment, also created a powerful sexual energy that lay just beneath the surface. It was a dance of desire and denial, and the very act of not having sex became a kind of erotic game in itself. It's like a long, slow striptease that never quite gets to the end, and the tension of that unfulfillment was the entire point. Historians still argue whether courtly love was a genuine expression of a new kind of romantic ideal or just a social construct that gave noblemen an excuse to flirt with married women. Did the knights truly feel this kind of pure, spiritual love, or was it just a convenient way to engage in a kind of sanctioned and sometimes successful adultery? The poetry and the stories often seem to suggest a genuine, heartfelt emotion. But the social realities of the time, with their arranged marriages and power dynamics, suggest that it might have been a more cynical game. It's a debate that touches on the very nature of human emotion, and whether our feelings are a product of our culture or something more universal. The contrast between courtly love and the church's view of intimacy is a powerful one. While the church saw all sexual desire as a potential sin, courtly love celebrated desire as a source of beauty and inspiration. While the church sought to contain sex within the confines of marriage, courtly love celebrated a love that was by its very nature outside of marriage. It was a kind of secular religion of love with its own rituals, its own codes, and its own saints and sinners. And it gave people, especially women, a kind of power and agency they often didn't have in their daily lives. The courtly lady, while still bound by the rules of her time, was the object of a knight's devotion, and her every word and gesture was a source of meaning. It was a beautiful and sometimes dangerous fantasy, but it shows a side of the medieval psyche that was far more complex and romantic than you might think. And remember, the Confessor's Handbook, the priests who wrote them, would have had a very, very hard time with the idea of courtly love. It would have been a whole new category of sin to deal with. We've journeyed through the chaste ideals of courtly love. But now, let's pull back the curtain on a place where the tension between piety and passion was at its most intense, and for some, its most tragic. You're no longer in a castle, but in a quiet monastery or a secluded nunnery, a place where people have taken a solemn vow of celibacy, promising to dedicate their lives to God. But even here, in the heart of spiritual devotion, human nature found a way to assert itself. This is the world of the erotic lives of monks and nuns, a world of forbidden realities and persistent rumors. A mainstream historical fact is that the vow of celibacy, while a cornerstone of clerical life, was often difficult to uphold. Monasteries and convents were not just spiritual retreats. They were also social and economic institutions, and the people who entered them were still well people. They had desires, they had passions, and they had needs that a life of prayer and contemplation couldn't always satisfy. The Church's records and the writings of reformers and critics are filled with evidence of transgressions, from whispered affairs to more serious and widespread sexual misconduct. The reality was that a life of celibacy was a difficult and unnatural burden, and many were not up to the task. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky tidbit. The monastic handbooks and rulebooks, which were meant to guide monks and nuns in their spiritual lives, often contained extremely detailed and sometimes bizarre rules for avoiding temptation. They would forbid monks from being alone with women, from even looking at them for too long, and from wearing certain kinds of clothing that might be seen as too worldly or too provocative. Nuns were often required to wear heavy, concealing garments, and their hair was always to be covered. The rules went so far as to forbid monks and nuns from touching each other even accidentally. These rules, in their own way, tell you everything you need to know about what was actually happening. You don't create a set of rules against touching if no one is ever touching. It's like finding a "do not feed the bears" sign in a national park. You know someone has been feeding the bears. The very existence of these detailed rules is a testament to the persistent reality of sexual temptation within the monastery walls. Historians still argue whether the stories of clerical sexual misconduct were a widespread reality, or if they were often exaggerated by reformers and critics of the church. The reformers, who were often trying to clean up the church's act, had a vested interest in portraying the clergy as corrupt and lustful, and the critics, who were often on the outside looking in, might have been prone to gossip and rumor. So while we have ample evidence of misconduct, it's hard to say just how widespread it was. Were most monks and nuns living lives of pious celibacy with a few bad apples, or was the whole system shot through with hypocrisy and sin? It's a debate with no easy answer, and it's a great example of how the historical record can be shaped by the motivations of those who wrote it. The erotic lives of monks and nuns weren't just about sexual acts. They were also about the powerful, often condemned force of sexual fantasy. The monastic writings are full of advice on how to deal with impure thoughts, and the spiritual struggle against lust was a constant theme. Monks and nuns were told to pray, to fast, and to engage in strenuous labor to exhaust the body and hopefully the mind. But even then the fantasies persisted. It was a kind of spiritual torment, a constant battle against a part of themselves that they had vowed to extinguish. And remember that fear of the incubus. A lonely monk or nun struggling with a lustful thought in the dark of night might easily have believed that they were being preyed upon by a succubus or an incubus. It was a way of externalizing an internal struggle, a way of blaming the devil for something that was simply human. The monastic life, in its own way, was the ultimate test of human nature, and for many it was a test they were destined to fail. We've arrived at our final stop, leaving the silent cloisters behind for the bustling and sometimes brutal public square. This is where all the threads of our story, the church's rules, the whispers of folk wisdom, the bawdy jokes, and the clerical hypocrisy, came together in a final and often cruel reckoning. You're no longer a participant or an observer, but a witness to the final public consequences of a private act. This is the world where sex society and the law's cruel hand met to mete out punishment and reinforce the moral order. A mainstream historical fact is that sexual transgressions outside of marriage were not just a matter for the confessional. They were a matter for the courts. Fornication, adultery, and sodomy were all criminal offenses, and the punishments could be severe. Depending on the time and place, a person convicted of a sexual crime might face fines, public whipping, or a period of banishment. Adultery in particular was a serious crime, and it was often punished more harshly for women than for men. The woman might be shamed, branded, or even executed, while the man might get off with a fine or a lighter punishment. This legal disparity shows how deeply ingrained the patriarchal system was, and how a woman's sexual purity was seen as a matter of public honor and legal importance. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky tidbit. The public shaming for sexual transgressions was often as feared, if not more so, than the physical punishment. A common punishment was to force the offender to wear a placard around their neck detailing their crime, and to stand in the town square for a certain period of time. This was a kind of performance of shame, a way of publicly marking the sinner and warning others against a similar fate. But the most bizarre and creative punishments were often reserved for those who broke the unspoken rules of sexual decorum. For example, in some places, a person convicted of adultery might be forced to ride a horse backward through the town with the horse's tail in their hand. It was a kind of public humiliation that was meant to be both a punishment and a source of morbid entertainment, a kind of medieval reality TV show where the stakes were real. Historians still argue whether the severity of these punishments was a genuine attempt to maintain social order or a way for the powerful to control the lives of the less powerful. The laws around sexual crimes were often used to target the poor, the unmarried, and the marginalized, while the wealthy and the well-connected could often get away with their transgressions with a simple fine or a quiet penance. Was this a genuine attempt to enforce a moral code, or was it a way of reinforcing the class and power structures of the time? The debate forces us to confront the fact that history is often written by the victors, and that the laws of the past were often used to serve the interests of those who created them. The final reckoning for sexual transgressions wasn't just about the law. It was also about the community. In a small medieval village, a person who was known to have committed a sexual sin might be ostracized, whispered about, and shunned. They might lose their friends, their business, and their place in the community. The punishment was not just a legal one, it was a social and personal one. It was a world where your private life was in many ways a public concern, and where a mistake in the bedroom could have consequences that lasted a lifetime. And remember the Confessor's Handbook. The public shaming and legal punishment were the real-world consequences of those sins, the final and most brutal step in the Church's system of spiritual and social control. The fear of that shaming and the fear of that punishment was a powerful force that shaped the lives of countless medieval people. It was a world where a stolen kiss could lead to a public whipping, and where a whispered secret could lead to a life of shame. And so we come to the end of our journey. The candlelight flickers lower now, and the stories of sin and sanctity, of desire and damnation begin to fade. You can almost hear the soft whisper of the past, a gentle sigh of a world that was both more rigid and more chaotic than we ever imagined. The rules were strict, the punishments were harsh, but beneath it all, the human heart beat on full of its own secrets, its own desires, and its own quiet defiance. The men and women we've met were not just figures in a history book. They were people just like you and me, trying to navigate their lives in a world that was both magical and terrifying, a world that was always watching, and a world that, in its own way, was just a little bit more human than we ever gave it credit for. Sweet dreams.